Hey, what's going on, everybody? So today I want to share with you what my web developer roadmap looked like and what my personal path and experience was actually like, as opposed to a lot of these roadmaps that you're seeing on YouTube. So that's the reason why I wanted to make this video, was because there's a lot of videos like that. I think they're all really good. They're loaded with information, but I also want to show you that there is a different route in how you can approach this, a different way to do this, because there's a lot of steps in those. It could get confusing. It could get overwhelming. So I figured if I just share my experience, it could show you that there's a different way of entering the industry. So let's go ahead and get started from all the way in the no code side of things, because that's how I got my start. That was building out Wix websites for first a personal project, and then eventually going into building out WordPress websites for clients, because I started freelancing, started a web dev agency, and sold a bunch of websites and doing SEO and marketing for local businesses. So that meant your local plumber, your local construction company, basically any kind of restaurant, anything like that. And I did that for 6 months, maybe a year, without writing a single line of code. So this was all WordPress, and that's how I got my initial start into web development. So the first start in actually coding was HTML and CSS. So I was running this agency for a bit, freelancing on the side, doing stuff like that while freelancing with the agency too. And it got to a point where if you've used WordPress or any of these platforms, you can find them to be a little bit limiting if a client asks you to customize something, or if you just want to change something up a little bit. So I decided that I needed to learn HTML and CSS. So this was the first line of code I've ever written. I bought the book HTML and CSS by John Duckett, and I just kind of tore that book apart, started going through it. And it took me about a week to learn about HTML. So or learn how HTML works and what it actually does. So I started learning about basic tags, how to first build up or how to create an index.html page or an HTML page, and then how to open it up in the browser, how to get some text out there. And then I went through forms, lists, tables, stuff like that, basically all your HTML tags. And that was pretty simple. That took about a week, and it made sense. Okay, we're just getting content out on the page, and that's basically what HTML does. It's the core foundation of the browser, I guess. It's rendering content. In that same book, there's also the CSS portion. So I started learning about what CSS is, and CSS was basically the way of styling a page and making that website look good, and you have to interact with these HTML elements. So I started learning about IDs and classes, how to connect a CSS file to an HTML page, and I started styling things. So I styled the text, started styling tables, styling the list items, buttons, making boxes, working with divs, and so on. And after a little bit of that, maybe about 5 days of just kind of connecting the HTML and CSS together, was when I got to layouts. And when I started, at the time, I believe Flexbox was already out there, but it was all floats. So I started making layouts using floats in CSS. So that's where HTML and CSS really started making sense to me, and I was able to make responsive websites and basically building out my own pages and then applying those to my WordPress themes. So all in all, it was about 30 days, maybe a little bit more, in grasping HTML and CSS, really understanding it, just building the same page over and over again, and just making sure that I'm comfortable with it. Now, the traditional route you see in roadmaps is usually JavaScript next, and that's fine to go that route. But for me, I just stuck to HTML and CSS. And the next language, or I guess language or scripting language that you want to say, that I picked up was actually Python. So I had this gap in between HTML and CSS and sticking to that for a bit, where I finally, when I was working at this company, I actually ended up taking a job at a company. I wanted to build out a full stack application because they had this system in the office. They wanted to rebuild it. I'm sure many of you know the story, but I wanted to build it. And I figured, okay, now I need a real programming language. I need to be able to actually build an application, put it up on a server, and have it interact with a database and so on. So I needed something that was pretty complex. So I was trying to figure out, or I was trying to decide between languages, and there was PHP, there was Ruby on Rails with the framework and so on. And I decided on Python because I wanted to learn a little bit about data science and machine learning, but not yet. I just wanted to build websites, but I figured if I learn Python, I'll at least have some foundation for that. So I dug into Python. So we went from learning HTML and CSS in about 2015 to learning Python at the end of 2017. So almost 3 years in between those. So we're not going the JavaScript route, we're going into Python now. So I started learning Python. It took me about 30 days to really understand how it works. I was able to start running Python, downloaded it locally, learned about variables and lists and strings and functions and classes and that kind of stuff, and loops also, and basically figured out that Python is something that I can do. And I realized, okay, if I want to build an application, I don't really see how Python can do this, because I was told that it could. I was reading articles and everyone said Python can handle that for me. But I also didn't know about frameworks like Flask and like Django. And I started reading into those, and I realized that Django was probably the thing that I needed to really build out a real application, because it's possible with Python, but there's a lot of work that you'd have to, or a lot of code that you'd have to write by hand, and it just didn't make sense to go that route. So I started learning Django. So 30 days of Python, 3 months of Django, and that's where I felt comfortable enough to really start spinning up an application. And that's the whole story of how I pitched my boss on the idea of that app. So won't go into that now, but basically about 6 months into building out that application, so 6 months from when I started learning Python and Django to working on the application, I started needing to make basically interactions. Oh, and I guess I probably should jump back into this. In this process was also, I learned about Bootstrap to enhance my website, Postgres to add my database, and let's see, there was also Heroku and AWS. So AWS S3 buckets and the relational database service. So I had to get my application online. So, okay, back to that. Once the application was online, there was features that I wanted to add to the website that were really limiting with simple Python and Django, because right now it's a simple request and response cycle. There's really no way of updating my website without having to refresh the page every single time. So started learning about JavaScript, and JavaScript was one of those things that was really intimidating in the beginning, because when I was learning HTML and CSS, there was also the book by John Duckett, same author, looks exactly the same, but it's JavaScript and jQuery. So when I looked at it the first time, it was super scary 2 years ago, and I bought that book and I just started going into it, and I realized that it wasn't all that difficult. It took some time, but now that I had a programming language of Python under my belt, that I at least knew how functions work and variables work, I realized it was all syntax, and then obviously a little bit of I guess a little bit more learning, because now with JavaScript, in that book, I learned about DOM manipulation, about state management, and about making requests so we don't have to refresh the page every single time a user clicks on a button or does something. So it was about 6 months into that, there was JavaScript, and probably about a year after that is when I started using React. So my story goes all the way from basically Wix to React. That was my full stack. There was little things there, here and there, libraries that I use like Google Maps. There was Zing charts for graphing data, but React came in about a year after I built that entire application. And now the reason why I learned React was because I realized that state management was super hard with vanilla JavaScript. It took a lot to basically keep a store inside of the browser, if anybody knows how Redux works or how state management works. But I realized that in order to really make this application work and how make buttons interactive with different parts of the website, a web framework like React can make things a lot simpler. It's not the only way to do things, but it made things simpler. So all in all, that was the entire story. That's still the stack that I stick to today. But in that, I did learn about promises and so on. I'm thinking about what those roadmaps usually show you, but I didn't learn half the things those roadmaps say. And I know that those roadmaps usually do kind of highlight the main things you should focus on, but I was able to do it without a lot of that stuff. So that's why I figured I'd share this and give you some hope, and also let you know that you have to pick your own journey, use those as a guide, but you're also going to have to choose your own route, and don't get let down when it doesn't follow strictly by those lines. So thanks for watching this video. See you guys in another one.